In today's episode, you're going to hear from none other than Professor Bart Ehrman. I've been wanting to have Bart on the podcast for such a long time, and it's been so good to finally get a date in with him to be able to go through his story and his journey into academics and out of Christianity, as well as talking about his academic and popular work, about his blog, and hearing his answers to some of my questions about the New Testament, Christianity, how things got started, and also a really interesting one on how we use the Greek New Testament and manuscripts today in the translations of the Bible that we have in our homes and churches. So I hope you enjoy this episode and you're encouraged to go and check out Bart's blog. I'm a big fan, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't be involved with it, and the fact that it's all for charity just speaks volumes about this man's heart and passion for the poor. So without any further ado, here's my conversation with Professor Bart Ehrman. Welcome to When Belief Dies, a podcast honestly reflecting on faith, religion, and life. This podcast is all about listening. We want people to share their reasons for faith or their reasons for non-belief so that we can better understand what has or has not convinced somebody of the claims that different religions profess. This is a journey, it's not a destination, and I'm really excited to have you listening with us each week as we delve into different viewpoints from different parts of the world to try and uncover the truth. Enjoy the episode. Hello, and welcome to another episode of When Belief Dies. My name's Sam, and today I'm joined by Professor Bart Ehrman. Bart, it's great to have you on the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
So, Bart, I've been chatting back and forth with you for a little while now, and been getting involved with your blog and stuff. And I just couldn't help but kind of ask you to come on and share a little bit about your story and your journey and your work as well, and just kind of talk about the New Testament with you essentially. So I guess to kick things off, Bart, it'd be really cool just to hear about your story into academics and out of faith. I'm aware they weren't necessarily related, but they're two parallel streams that have kind of come together. So if you wouldn't mind kind of sharing with us, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, no, I'd say they actually are closely related because when I was in school, nobody thought I'd become a scholar. I mean, it's like, I was reasonably smart, but it's like this was not my thing. I was more into baseball, tennis, and things, and social life. So what happened when I was in high school, when I guess a junior in high school, I had a born again experience and became an evangelical Christian, and became extremely committed to my Christian faith. And when I graduated from school, instead of going to university, I went to Moody Bible Institute, which is a fundamentalist Bible college in Chicago. But because I was so passionate about my faith, I became a study addict. I mean, I would pull an all-nighter at least once a week studying, and on top of, because I just wanted to learn everything I could about the Bible. And so it was like I was crazy. And when I wasn't like working on my classes, I was just memorizing books of the Bible. It's like, oh my God. And so when I graduated from there, I decided to go to Wheaton College, and which was Billy Graham's alma mater, and which for me was a step towards liberalism. And so, but while I was there, I took Greek, and I realized I was good in Greek, and I was getting good grades and everything because I was studying so hard the whole time. And I decided to go into a career of academia. But the kind of irony was I wanted to become a scholar of the New Testament. I was especially interested in the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament and trying to figure out what the original New Testament said, given the fact that we had all these manuscripts that had differences in them, and you have to be a pretty good expert in languages to be able to pull that off. And so I decided to go to Princeton Theological Seminary to study with the world's expert on this, a man named Bruce Metzger. And the irony of it is that in my course of my research, I started realizing that my fundamentalist views about the Bible were simply not true, and that the Bible was not an inerrant word of God, and that there were mistakes, and there are all kinds of mistakes. I mean, there are contradictions and discrepancies, but there are also there are grammatical mistakes and there are historical mistakes and geographical mistakes. And I just realized they're mistakes, and so I ended up changing my religious points of view and became a liberal Christian for a number of years, and went on and did a PhD there with Metzger, and started teaching at Rutgers University. And so in many ways, the faith journey was very much like it wasn't just a parallel line; they were actually closely interrelated. And eventually, I left the faith altogether, probably 25 years ago. But that wasn't because of my more than that, maybe, yes, well, 25 years is it wasn't because of my biblical scholarship so much as because of the problem I was having with trying to understand how God could be in control of this world, given how much suffering there is, and it just, I mean, it just didn't make sense to me anymore. So I left the faith for those reasons, not because of my academic study.
Yeah, that's super helpful. It's a very similar story to me in regards to the why you left the faith. The kind of the PhD element isn't very similar to mine, but yeah, I think a big element for me for stepping away from Christianity was around this idea that the God that I was taught, the all-loving, all-powerful God that knew me by name and cared intimately about me, didn't add up essentially to the pain and suffering that we witness today, and also historic, like the evolutionary story and accounts of the world. It's very tricky. But I mean, you then went and wrote obviously many books, but one of your books, God's Problem, is almost like exploring the different sorts of theodicies and ways that people try and reconcile God with suffering, how those things didn't quite add up for you, which I thought was a really good and interesting book. And I wonder if you can kind of share with us a little bit about that. But
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. Because it's not that it wasn't a revelation to me that there's suffering in the world. I knew that, and I tried to explain it, and I had explanations that were satisfying to me at the time. I mention that because I always have Christians tell me, "Well, don't you understand? It's because," and they they tell me, as if for like I never knew that there's like anybody ever thought of something called free will, or that that I didn't realize that whatever. I mean, and so the whole journey for me in terms of the suffering problem, and that it eventually led to me leaving the faith, started when I was teaching at Rutgers University in New Jersey. I think I just finished my PhD, or maybe, yeah, I just finished my PhD. And I was asked to teach a course in the department called The Problem of Suffering in the Biblical Traditions. And so the idea of the class was that I would look at different ways different biblical authors dealt with this problem about why people suffer, especially the people of God suffer, if God has promised to help them and guide them and protect them, and it doesn't seem to be happening. And so the authors of the Bible have to explain why. And I jumped on the course because I had thought for a long time that virtually every author of the Bible is really concerned with this particular issue that you're calling theodicy, the question of how there can be a just God if there's such suffering in the world. And it's in modern day, since the Enlightenment, it's been premised on three statements, all of which on the surface Christians would say are true, but when you put the three together, they don't work. And the three are two of them, and you actually just said all three of them. God is all powerful, so he can do anything he wants, anything. God is all loving, and so he really wants the best for people, and there is suffering. And so, if God wanted to get rid of suffering, he surely could. I mean, he doesn't need to make it so that there are volcanoes, or tsunamis. I mean, he doesn't have to be that way. And if he loves people, I mean, surely he doesn't want them to be drowned or to be, immersed in lava or something. But he doesn't. And so the issue then in the modern philosophical discourse since the Enlightenment has been, well, how do you explain all three? And you have to work it out. The biblical authors didn't have our Enlightenment understandings of logic and this kind, but they basically saw this problem, and they actually said it sometimes in a similar way. And so the idea for this class was we were going to look at, what does the book of Proverbs say about suffering? What does the book of Job say about suffering? What does the book of Ecclesiastes? What does Jesus say? What does the book of Revelation? And the whole idea of this course was that they're all saying different things, and that what the book of Daniel says is really very different from what the book of Joel says. In fact, it's a contradiction. And what and what Jesus says is not at all what the Psalms say. And so I was doing this with this class and trying to get them to see that there was these different. I was still a Christian. I mean, I thought, you got to wrestle with it. You got to take it seriously. And it wasn't funny, but the strange thing was this is Rutgers in the 1980s. This would have been before your time. In the mid 80s, the other reason people went to school was so they could get a job and make a big salary. And so these are like middle class kids from New Jersey who were not interested in this kind of philosophical thing, and they didn't see what the problem of suffering was. What's the problem? And so it was during a time of one of these Ethiopian famines that ended up killing 2 million people or so. 2 million people starving to death. And the only way I could get them to see there's a problem here is I would bring in the front page of the New York Times that would have a picture of an Ethiopian woman who was starving to death with a child at her breast who wasn't getting any nourishment, wasn't getting any milk, who was starving to death. And I pointed this picture to the students. I'd say, look, this is a problem. If you believe in God, this is a problem. And they finally kind of got it. So that got me going. And for years after that, I continued to struggle with it. I read what philosophers said, and what theologians said, what biblical scholars said, what regular old folks say about the problem of suffering. I just got to a point where I said, I don't think there is a God who's in control. There's not. I mean, take a look. There's not. And it was probably about 25 years or so ago. Then I ended up leaving the faith.
I think that really rhymes or chimes with the Book of Ecclesiastes, where if you, I mean, it was actually one of your books that pointed out to me. I think it might have been your Heaven and Hell book actually, but essentially it's this idea that God was almost added to the narrative later, and actually what we have to start off with is this almost not atheistic, but almost very kind of this is all there is, this life is all there is, and it's fleeting and
Yeah,
it's going to go. And actually
yeah,
kind of God then gets added into that. And I kind of almost wonder, and this is quite a philosophical question, but I kind of almost wonder whether we as humans have almost created a God to try and explain the problems we have, but then as we begin adding these sorts of enlightenment tools to the mix, we then begin to question our answer to the original question, which is still the why is there suffering and pain, why is this going on?
yeah, yeah. I mean, the issue of what starts religion is a really, really complicated one, and so I'm not gonna solve that one here. And in universities, I suppose it's this way. It's probably this way in Britain if they, but we'll have my department of religious studies. We'll have an introduction to religion class, and the students spend the semester trying to figure out what religion means. It turns out it's not easy, let alone where did it come from. And so, but on kind of the most basic, simple level, I think that belief in superhuman beings is driven by both wonder and fear, and that people look around the world and they wonder how the hell that happened. Lightning just hit my house. We're used to cause and effect because as human beings, that's what we encounter in the natural world. And so when things happen, humans didn't cause. You got to figure out something. Well, some other being kind of like us caused it, or something like that. Or and then fear as well. But then, so when you have suffering, if you've got a God, if you end up as you do in especially in the Christian tradition, but starting with the Jewish tradition, with a God who really is the creator of all and is sovereign over all, and really has chosen people and really does love them, and yet this is happening to him. You got to have some explanation. And so the big explanation in the Old Testament, of course, is that the people of God are suffering because they've offended God and they've broken his laws, and so he's punishing them. And so, which is that's still a very common view. I mean, it's kind of frighteningly simplistic and scarily applied. I mean, when I wrote this book, How Jesus Became God, when I wrote this book on God's problem about the problem of suffering, I did a book tour around the country and talking to places and on radio shows and stuff. And I met this guy in Minneapolis, a pastor, who said, he was a liberal pastor. He was really smart, and he was not a fundamentalist. He wasn't a big believer in the Bible, but he was a Christian. And he said, he had been a couple weeks before this, he'd been visiting a parishioner whose 16-year-old daughter had died in a car accident. And he's, there's nothing you can say. I mean, there's not, you can just be there and help somebody and let them try and articulate their feelings. But this parishioner, this woman, said that she knew why her daughter had died. And he said, "Oh, really? Why?" She said, "Well, I promised God I would stop smoking, and I didn't do it. So he's punishing me. This guy says, "Oh, what do you even say to this?" I mean, it's like, are you crazy? Of course, that's not why. There's not a why here, and so, but people want a why, and so they settle for it.
Yeah, we do want whys, don't we? We're definitely why-seeking creatures, that's for sure.
We
Um,
are.
I think this kind of leads us quite nicely into talking about the New Testament and people's derived kind of desire for there to be whys that answer all our questions within the pages of the New Testament. I think quite often, especially the way that I was raised and the way that I kind of taught the Bible when I was a church pastor and stuff, is very much around this idea that the Bible holds answers to everything if you look and ask the right questions. And I obviously don't believe that necessarily anymore, but I think we definitely. I definitely, and this is something I'm reflecting on all the time, told people things that weren't true because I hoped they were true. I had hope that the Bible holds these answers, and therefore I can trust in the Bible for those reasons. And this kind of brings me into this other point, which is when people leave the faith, quite often they want to throw everything out. They want to say Jesus was a myth, in that he never existed, it's all pretend, we just need to kind of walk away from that. And then I kind of find that also very problematic, because I think there's a lot of good historical evidence that this person of Jesus was real. And I kind of wanted to ask you, because often people might read your work or try and engage with you because they almost want you to kind of deconstruct their idea of Christ and deconstruct their idea of
Yeah.
Jesus, but you actually write quite vehemently about the historical Jesus being an actual person, and that we can trust the text at least that far. And I wonder if you can kind of like touch on that a little bit for us today, Bart.
Yeah, no, this mythicist movement, the idea that Jesus is a myth. Um, it actually it's not a new thing. It started during the French Revolution, actually, but uh, every now and then there's people who say this. It's just now with the internet, people are saying, "Oh, really?" And it's a non-issue for scholars. It is not an issue for scholars. Period. But for experts, um, and it's a little bit worse, but it's comparable to what whenever my wife tells somebody that she's a Shakespeare scholar, the one thing they want to know is, did he really write the plays? And and she's like, I'm sorry, this is we don't even talk about this. This is not an issue in Shakespeare. It's not an issue, and they don't believe it because it's all they hear about on the internet, And so, but it's like that with the mythicists. I know personally know hundreds of biblical scholars. I know of thousands, and no, and so, yeah. But there are people who think that, and of course they do, because that's what people say. Jesus wasn't really a Jesus. He was actually a fiction come up because he was actually a sun god, or something, and he come up with something. And it's really not hard to explode all of that, even though there are a couple of smart people who say it, and so if you're smart and you say it, then people believe you. Um, I do deconstruct though what the Bible says about Jesus. So there's little. Look, I mean, I don't think there's for me, there is zero doubt that there was a man, Jesus. But the question is, what was he like? I mean, who was he? What did he do? What did he say? And you cannot just open the Gospel of John and say, oh, well, he said this. It's not that easy at all. We're talking about somebody who he's better attested than 99.999% of the world at the time, literally, far better attested than 99.999% of the world at the time. But the attestation is not the kind of thing that you have for the attestation of the existence of Barack Obama. And so, it's like we're talking about the ancient world here, and the sources are they're convincing on some points where there's on some issues about who Jesus was, there's very little debate among scholars, but there are lots of big issues that are also hotly debated. And it's much harder to say, did Jesus give the Lord's Prayer? It's much harder to answer that one than it is to answer, well, did Jesus exist? Yes, he existed. Did he say the Lord's Prayer? Well, it's not an easy question, actually. So I can obviously say a lot more about any of that you would want me to do. So
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And I was going to kind of ask you, I think sometimes for me, it's all I almost seek that sort of simple explanation. Like I almost kind of want to go, well, the Jesus that we read about in the Gospel of Mark is closer to the possible original Jesus because it's an earlier source, right? That's what most people agree on. And
Yeah, yeah,
obviously
yeah.
it's just not that simple. But do you think that there was that sort of pushing forwards of the narrative? So obviously, kind of by the Gospel of John, you have those 7 classic "I am" statements. Um, do we, as in scholars, sorry, do we have this idea from your field of expertise, Bart, where people are agreeing more that Jesus was probably more likely to be from like the Jesus of the Gospel of Mark? I'm not saying he was that Jesus, but more likely to be like that, or do we think that it's going to be some sort of hybrid going on? What are your thoughts?
So it's, as I said, it's an extremely complicated issue, because our sources are written decades after Jesus. Our gospel sources are decades after Jesus, um, but they're based on sources that were earlier, and we can reconstruct some of the earlier sources. Mark was almost certainly the first gospel. Um, there are reasons for thinking that. In other words, I mean, it would take it would take a long time to lay out all of the reasons for why Mark is almost certainly the first gospel, but it's not guesswork. There are really good arguments for it. Um, its its vision of who Jesus was is roughly similar to what you. It's pretty similar to what you get in Matthew in many ways. Um, Not quite as similar as what you get in Luke, but the three of them have so many striking similarities that, and not just those gospels, but those gospels are based on these earlier sources. Like your listeners probably heard of Q, maybe, and but then in others also. Then there's M, and then there's L, and these sources have a kind of, when you dig down deep into them, they have a fairly consistent vision of who Jesus was, and John's vision is very different. And so John, since uh, well, for most of the 20th century, John was set aside as being a different point of view, but it's not a modern thing. In as soon as we have Christians talking about the four Gospels at the end of the second century, people were saying that John is a different item. They would call it the spiritual gospel, by which they meant that it gave more of a kind of a theological interpretation of Jesus rather than a nuts and bolts. He said this, he did that kind of thing. And in very rough terms, that's still pretty much what most scholars think. Um, but so scholars have a number of criteria that they use to figure out what Jesus really said and did, and they're comparable to what you'd use for anything. I mean, if you're trying to figure out if some, who done it in like you've got a criminal case and you're trying to figure out who did this person commit the crime or not, there's certain kinds of evidence that always come out. You want to know if there's anybody, you want to know if like anybody saw him do it, and if so, if there are lots of people who saw him do it, can you get independent people don't confer with each other and say, yeah, he did it, and what if you get testimony from somebody who actually wants the guy to be proven innocent, like his mother, and says things that prove him guilty? Well, if she's not saying it she's not saying it because she wants to. She's saying because, yeah, I can't, I got to say the truth. Yeah, he did do that. And so when you have a testimony like that, that's like different people all agree on things that are contrary to their interests. When in a court case, that's pretty good evidence. And so historians use that kind of evidence, not just for Jesus, but for Julius Caesar or for Charlemagne or whatever. I mean, this is just how historians do their work. And so they do this kind of work with Jesus using the sources that are available to us to come up with some kind of sensible picture. And it's just not the picture that most of us grew up with. From our evangelical background, uh, I at least did not think that Jesus was an apocalyptic preacher who thought that, within the lifetime of his disciples, all of history is going to come to a screeching halt. I just didn't think that. But that apparently is who he was. Um, I absolutely believe in deconstructing the image of Jesus, but I don't believe in dissolving it. I mean, I'd be happy to dissolve. There's nothing personally at stake here. I mean, if it came to kind of personal preferences, I mean, I could. I mean, yeah, it'd be great for me if I could show Jesus didn't exist. Great for me personally, but it's just like I can't. I mean, he did exist. So, I'd like to show Donald Trump didn't exist, but I mean, he does.
Oh, I like that. And I think you also kind of see this within the epistles of Paul and some of the kind of the other letters that we have is this idea that Jesus is going to come back soon. Just keep being faithful to the message that I preached to you. And then you kind of see this, oh, he's not coming back in our lifetime. What does that mean? How do we carry on now? What does this mean for the next generation to pick this up and carry on? I kind of feel like this is almost what spurred people into writing the Gospels and these epistles to a certain point, where the epistles were also kind of just encouraging people, but especially the Gospels and maybe some of the later epistles, you kind of had this we need to keep this captured, like we need to get this down and make sure it's passed on and make sure there's some way that we can share this around, because we're not going to be here anymore to preach on this and to share this. Is that right? Is that a good way of looking at it?
But it's hard to know what really motivated these people, because they didn't tell us. We don't even know what their names were, let alone what their motivations were. But it is interesting, when you set up the Gospels chronologically, not I mean, there are criteria for deciding which one was first, then was second, third, and there are criteria people have. But once you do it, like you've done that, and you set it up so that, for example, Mark is probably first, then probably Matthew, then probably Luke, then probably John, then say the Gospel of Thomas, which isn't in the New Testament. But you do that with respect to this question you're talking about, the end coming right away. And it's very interesting when you just look at them chronologically, because Mark, our earliest, Jesus is still saying, before this generation passes away, these things will take place. So some of you disciples won't die before you see it happen, which is what Paul was saying a few years earlier. Paul expected that he would be alive when it happened. And so you get that in the earliest gospel. When you get to Matthew, you still have that emphasis pretty much. By the time you get to Luke, a little bit later, Luke is kind of hedging his bets. And Luke isn't actually having Jesus say it's going to happen in your generation. Luke is saying it's going to happen in my generation. And so Jesus isn't telling his disciples this anymore, probably because they weren't alive, and it wouldn't make sense for Luke to have him say it. When you get to John, it's not about the end coming right away at all. There's a few verses where they're kind of leftovers of this view, but basically John thinks eternal life is now. It's not something that's going to happen when some kind of disruption in history. You believe in Jesus, you have eternal life. If you don't believe in Jesus, you are condemned. Now you can. And so when you get to the Gospel of Thomas, later still, Jesus actually preaches against the idea that there's going to be this cataclysmic break in history and the kingdom of God will arrive. He opposes it. And so you line these things up, and it's not hard to figure out when you do the chronology, why that is, because they thought it was going to come right away. It didn't come right away. And so they had to change both what he said and what he meant.
Yeah, and this is something that you just don't hear in any church, like any church setting that I've ever experienced. Like, you just don't hear people looking at the books pre the New Testament and books post the New Testament and go, this is the array, this is the direction it's going in. This isn't a completed volume which you're getting given as the keys to the car, right? This is actually much more of a of a painting in flow. Like there's almost like an artist who's actually painting onto the canvas and actually building up the story, and that's what we seem to have.
Well, you can't get that in Protestant churches, especially because Protestant churches are very big on going back to the original. And so the idea that the religion develops in any kind of legitimate way is, that's Catholic. They believe in that later tradition stuff. We believe we get back to the original. And so you can't really get that very much. But I will say that in liberal Protestant seminaries, mainline Protestant seminaries in the United States and probably in Britain as well, this is what's taught. I mean, seminary students learn. I learned it in seminary at a Presbyterian at Princeton Seminary, which is a Presbyterian. This is where I learned this material. My classmates all learned the material. They learned all sorts of stuff that they never tell anybody in their churches. And I think it's really not right. I mean, I understand why. It's job security. They get fired if they really. But I mean, and I'm not saying, I don't think that you have to. I don't think a pastor has to preach this from the pulpit. That Jesus said is going to come in the lifetime of his disciples. He was wrong. You don't expect that from the pulpit. But they do have education classes, and you kind of wish that going to adult education classes in churches would get educated. Like they might learn something that these people learned in seminary instead of this kind of schlock that they learned because everybody's afraid to say something.
I want to take a minute of your time to talk about supporting When Belief Dies. This will always be an advertisement-free podcast, and for that reason, I hope you will be willing to share this episode with your friends and family. Subscribe to the podcast in your favourite podcast app and check us out over on YouTube. Finally, I want to ask you to consider supporting the show financially. You can support the show on Patreon with a monthly gift or a one-off donation via PayPal. Everything that you give goes directly towards running and improving the blog and podcast. Take a look in the description for all the links, and thank you for supporting the show. Right, let's get back to this week's episode. Yeah, you'd hope. I still remember when I was so I was a youth pastor before I began kind of being a preacher, pastor of the church that I've left, and it was really interesting. So I went to this sort of a youth event, and I was very much getting into kind of reading more about the New Testament. And I just read N.T. Wright and Marcus Borg book Jesus, Two Visions, where they kind of look at the different sorts of accounts we have of Jesus, and they kind of give their two different like visions of what this means. Basically, I kind of walked into the bookshop, as there are lots of these sorts of Christian camps for youth, and there were loads of N.T. Wright books, loads of like Andy Stanley books, and The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, and all these sorts of books. And I was like, why do you not have anything where like an author, as you clearly like, and someone who's got a different viewpoint, just having a dialogue rather than just going straight for something else like a Dominic Crossan or something like that? Why don't you have something that's at least kind of showing them that there is other opinions? And they're like, we just don't want anybody to be led astray. We don't want to challenge anybody's belief because it's so rooted in, if you don't believe this specific thing, you're going to go to hell and you aren't going to be saved. You aren't going to be included. It's a very worrying situation.
Well, it is, but it goes all the way back to early Christianity. That that I think people in our environment tend to think that religions are naturally exclusivistic. That like if you're one thing, you're not another thing. So if you're a Christian, you're not a Jew, and if you're a Buddhist, you're not a Roman Catholic, and like if you're a Muslim, you're not. So you have these exclusive. And in the ancient world that Christianity emerged out of, the only thing close to an exclusivistic religion was Judaism, and Jews were not exclusive in the sense they said, well, you either agree with us or you're going to hell, because they didn't believe in the afterlife anyway. It's just this is our tradition, and so they weren't exclusive in the sense they said you need to accept this. They're exclusive in the sense that this is all we're going to accept. Everyone else was a polytheist. So like 93 to 95% of the world was polytheist, which meant they worshiped many gods. And nobody said, look, if you worship my god Zeus, if you worship Zeus, I'm sorry, you got to give up Apollo. No, you just, okay, I haven't worshipped Zeus, but maybe I will now. Okay, yeah. Oh, and I worship Athena. That sounds good. I'll worship Athena. You add things on. And Christians came along and said, no, there's only one God. And Christ is the way that you have access to that God. If you don't believe in Christ, you will be punished in this life and after death. And Christians come up with the idea of heaven and hell as a place where you're going to, those who believe in Christ will go to heaven, and those who don't will go to hell. And you had to believe the right things about Christ, right? You couldn't like be one of these heretics, who believes like a Gnostic or something, or whatever. And you've got to be you got to toe the line. And that idea of toeing the line came down through the Middle Ages, down to today, through the Protestant Reformation, down to and so that there's one truth, there's one God, he's got one Son who is one person, not two people, he's not Jesus and Christ, he's one person, Jesus Christ. There's one faith, one Lord, one baptism, it's all one. And so you got to believe the right one. And so, so that's why they don't promote like open minds. They promote the truth.
Yeah. I think that fits really nicely into something that I was wanting to chat to you about as well, which is this idea of kind of creeds and how people use creeds to almost capture theology and their truth. And a lot of Christians, especially notice this probably in more of like American style preaching, people like Andy Stanley, kind of one of their big arguments for saying that Christ, really was God, who came and died and rose again. they point to things like 1 Corinthians 15:3-5, and they'll say things like, this is a creed that Paul has captured within his writing, and this shows that right from a couple of years after Jesus died, people were sharing these sorts of things and saying that God, this man Jesus was actually in fact God, and they were trying to work out what that meant for them. I would love to hear your thoughts on that, because I definitely see a lot of Christians holding on to things like that as the proof that it was right from the moment that they realized he'd risen from the dead, from going to his tomb, that they believed this.
Yeah, yeah,
But I kind of
yeah.
go on then, go for it.
So, well, I'll say several things about it. I mean, uh, first of all, I agree that 1 Corinthians 15:3-5, which is it's the passage where Paul's reminding the Corinthians what he taught them. And what he reminds them, and he says that I taught you of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and he was buried. Christ was raised from the dead on the third day according to the scriptures, and he appeared to Cephas and to the 12. And so that's the thing. Scholars have long understood this to be a creed that Paul was quoting. It's not one of the reasons for thinking that is that the literary quality of it is unusual for Paul. It's if you actually put it out in the Greek, it is very balanced, and it's a systematic statement where like this point corresponds to that point, this point to that point, this point to that point, and it's terse, and it's not like his normal writing. So it looks like he's quoting something. That's right. Um, Paul was writing this in the mid 50s. I do not understand why everybody goes around saying this thing was composed 2 years after Jesus died. Where does that come from? What, I mean, what? I don't get it. I mean, I genuinely don't get it. I mean, I do get it. It's so they can prove how early it is. But what's the evidence? It just means that this is something that Paul taught the Corinthians before he wrote 1 Corinthians. And so it could have been in the year 51. Why does it have to be 32? So I'll say that. So I think that's a crazy argument. And I have to say, apologists just tend to come up with crazy arguments. Why don't they come up with good arguments? That's not a good argument. And I know people like William Lane Craig go around saying this stuff. Come on, what's the evidence? Maybe they've got the evidence and just don't tell me. I don't know. But so there's that. I will say two other things, though. First of all, that creed says nothing about Jesus being God. The creed is about Jesus dying and being raised from the dead in fulfillment of what the scriptures say. Second thing, I think that the earliest Christians did believe that. I think that probably not long after Jesus' death, some of his followers came to think he got raised from the dead. Absolutely. How else would we have Christianity if they didn't say it? He's a dead guy, another dead prophet. Oh God, we lost another one. No, I mean, they thought he got raised from the dead. And the third thing I'll say is, I mean, I've changed my mind about this in the last 10 years, but I think probably they did think he was divine in some sense. When he got raised from the dead, for the early Christians, that meant he was taken up to heaven. The early Christians did not have the view of the Gospels that Jesus hung around for 40 days or whatever and was like eating fish with his disciples and things. They thought that the reason the tomb was empty is because God had taken Christ out and taken him up to heaven. This idea that a human being could be taken to heaven is widespread. I mean, there's not a lot of instances of it, but you get it in Greek myths, you get it in Roman myths, you get it in people living in the time of Jesus versus people who are really Julius Caesar was taken up. And what happens to people who are taken up, whether it's the legendary Romulus or the historical Julius Caesar, or if it's Enoch or Elijah, or in all cultures, Greek, Roman, and Jewish, in that part of the world, they all thought that if somebody was taken up to heaven, they were made into a divine being of some kind, which meant that unlike the rest of us, they're not going to die. They're going to live forever. Why? Because God likes them, or the gods like them. Zeus likes this person, or whatever. And so when the Christians said that Jesus got taken up, I mean, their only conclusion from it had to be he's been made a divine being. That's a far cry from the Nicene Creed. That is not that Christ always existed as one substance with the Father by whom all things were made. that's a whole later thing. And 1 Corinthians 15 has nothing to do with that, other than the fact that it's the beginning of it. But so yeah, I don't know if that speaks to what you were asking
Yeah,
about.
yeah. No, that's really helpful. I've always found it to be a very challenging thing to understand because, as you said, it doesn't make sense that it happened just a couple of years after Jesus died and supposedly rose from the dead. It's just
I'll
strange.
tell you why I think people say that, and I think it's because they don't understand what a term means. I might be wrong about this, but scholars call that a pre-Pauline fragment. Uh, they call it pre-Pauline because it existed before Paul wrote it in this letter. That's what they mean by pre-Pauline. But I think people who aren't trained in this field see pre-Pauline and they assume that means previous to Paul converting to believe in Jesus. That's not what the word means. But I just realized this a few years ago. That must be what they're thinking. Because somebody said to me, "But it's pre-Pauline." Well, that just means it's written before Paul wrote this letter. No, no, it means before Paul was a Christian. Why not say it's pre-Pauline means it was before Paul was born? This thing about Christ showed up in 3 BCE. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Either does your argument.
That's amazing. Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I think that's the only way that it makes sense, right? Is this idea that Saul became Paul shortly after Jesus died, after the stoning of Stephen and on the road to Damascus, and they must think that it was written before that these people were sharing and distributing that.
Pre-Pauline.
Yeah.
Scholars use that to mean something technical, and people don't understand what it means. Apparently, even Christian apologists who at least have been to college, they ought to know this. They took classes. Surely they took classes on something. So,
So I think another really interesting thing about all of this is, especially from your book, Misquoting Jesus, something that I wasn't really aware of, and it makes complete sense, was that you kind of expressed throughout your book, or especially the first few chapters, how the people copying the letters that they had of the New Testament before Christianity became kind of the accepted like Roman kind of religion in 313, when Constantine almost became a Christian. I used quotation marks there because we're not quite sure what he actually did believe. But anyway, yeah. So basically, Christianity then becomes this more dominant religion, which then kind of gets funding to be able to kind of have people properly copying these texts. But before that, it was people who were wanting to kind of copy it so someone could read it out. They wanted a copy they had was wearing out, so they wanted to make sure it was all written down. But these people weren't kind of paid or academic in their in the way that they copied these texts. I kind of wondered if you could kind of chat us through the sort of discrepancies that we see within the different sorts of copying styles, kind of post and then pre 313, if that's all right.
yeah, yeah. The history of copying the New Testament is very interesting. This is what I did my PhD in, that particular area, and it's what I spent the first 20 years of my scholarship on. Are those issues? So I've been long interested in them. There's a kind of a funny phenomenon that most people haven't really thought reflectively on, which is, in Judaism they had this they when Jews in the Middle Ages were copying manuscript, they did not make a mistake. If they made a mistake, they threw the manuscript out. I mean, it was like they had rules; they could not make mistakes. And same with Islam. I mean, you get two copies of the Quran; it's the same book. I mean, and Christians didn't do that. It's a little bit weird, but I mean, that's why I'm pointing out it's a little bit strange that Christians didn't do that, because you'd think they would have done that, but they didn't. But in the Middle Ages, copying practices are pretty well set, and most Christian copyists in the Middle Ages are pretty good. They tend to be monks in monasteries who do this. This is what they do. They copy texts. Um, yeah, in the first 3 centuries, you didn't have monasteries, and you didn't have Christians. Probably were not trained to be scribes. The earliest Christians were just whoever happened to be the earliest scribes copying text. Whoever's copying the Gospel of Mark for the first time is almost certainly just somebody in the congregation who's got this book and they want another copy of it. And this person happens to be able to read and write for whatever reason. He does something that requires reading and writing. And so he's the guy, so he copies it. No, but he's not a Xerox machine, and he's not a trained copyist. He probably makes some mistakes. And then some other person wants that copy, and so they copy it. When they copy that copy, they're also not a trained professional. and they might be good, they might be not so good. We don't know, but they copy the one that had some mistakes in it, and they copy the mistakes, and then they make their own mistakes. And so, another person comes along and copies that person's copy of the copy, and then they replicate, and it goes on like that. They keep making mistakes and replicating the mistakes, and the only time you can correct a mistake is when you realize, wait, that doesn't make any sense. I think the guy I got who made this copy must have messed up here. I'm going to correct that, and you correct it. But there's no way to know whether you correct it correctly because you're not looking at the original. You're just trying to figure out what it originally said. And so, you might be doing this in Ephesus, and Mark maybe did his thing in Rome, and you don't even know Mark. It's like you're just copying this book and you're trying to make a correction. So, but now if you miscorrect a mistake, then you got the original text and you got the mistake, and now you got the mistaken correction of the mistake. Like it goes like that for a few centuries, uh, and so the reality is we don't have Mark's copy. We don't have a copy of any the original of any of the books of the New Testament. We almost certainly don't have any copies of the originals or copies of the copies of the originals. I mean, with Mark's gospel, the first copy we have is from about the year 200, so it's about 130 years after Mark. And this copy we have from the year 200 contains portions of half the chapters. We don't have a complete copy of Mark until about the year 370, so about 300 years it was after it was made. So the big issue that scholars have had, and the reason I got into this in the first place, is the interesting question. We have lots of these manuscripts, later manuscripts. We got thousands of these later Greek manuscripts, over 5,600 complete or partial fragmentary manuscripts, but they all have differences in them. So we're not speculating that a scribe might have changed it. We've got thousands of these manuscripts, and they have hundreds of thousands of differences in them. Literally hundreds of thousands. The best estimates lately are that there are 400,000 differences in our manuscripts of the New Testament, the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. So that's not good news. but so that's bad news. But the good news is that the vast majority of these 400, 500,000 differences, whatever, the vast majority of them are completely insignificant and don't matter for anything. And probably the majority of them are misspelled words. Like, you know, who cares if you misspelled the word Jesus as long as you know it's talking about Jesus? I mean, you might leave off an S or something, but it doesn't matter. So most of them don't matter. Some of them do matter, and some of them matter a lot. Like they affect, some of them affect what a verse means. Some affect the meaning of an entire passage. Some of them affect how you interpret an entire book. And the problem is there are a lot of these that really matter are ones that scholars can't agree on what the original was. And so, yeah, so my book, Misquoting Jesus, is about that, about how it's not like you just pick up a Bible and start reading it and you're reading like what Paul wrote. You're reading an English translation of a Greek text, and the Greek text is reconstructed by scholars based on manuscripts that all have hundreds of thousands of differences in them. So like it's a complicated thing.
Yeah, yeah, and I've often wondered as well is obviously a lot of the printing presses, especially in the kind of bygone ages, when people were printing the New Testament, it was often a Christian organization or charity or kind of printing press that would publish these things. And I kind of wonder today if when you pick up the NIV or you pick up the ESV or whatever it is you pick up, obviously a lot of these are still overseen by Christians who wants the text to potentially say the most Christian message that it can say. And I've kind of often wondered, I mean, I might be wrong, completely wrong on this. It's something I've not really kind of pushed before, but I've often wondered whether they would be picking potential Greek versions that would align more with the theology they want to kind of back up with their Bible. Do you think that could ever happen?
It could happen. I don't think it does quite that way. Virtually all these translation committees are translating the same text. And so this volume is called the Novum Testamentum Graeci by it's called the Nestle Aland because this kind of edition was started by a guy named Nestle, and then it got taken up by a guy named Aland. And so this one, I just got this one because it's it has an English side and that has both the NRSV and the NIV. Then it has the Greek side. I like this for my classes because I can read the Greek, but like students will say, "Yeah, well, my translation says," and I can see trying to figure out how they did it. All the translations that you would get today, virtually all, except for like the New King James or something, but the ESV or the RSV, the NRSV, the New Jerusalem Bible, they're all basically translating the same Greek. But there are two things to be said about this. So this Greek was constructed by a group of scholars based on their study of all the manuscripts, of the most important manuscripts. And my mentor, Bruce Metzger, was one of the people, 5 people who did this. And so this is as good as we're ever going to get, probably as close as we're ever going to get. But there are two provisos. One is that at the bottom of the page, I don't know if you can see this, but at the bottom of the page, there's a list of differences among the manuscripts. And this list is a really partial list. I mean, it is like a really partial list, but it tells you important differences among different manuscripts. And some translators will decide, actually, the thing in the apparatus is probably the original reading, and the one in the text is probably not the original reading. And that's a perfectly legitimate judgment, because you have to decide in places. And it is true that some people will decide in line with their personal beliefs sometimes. They won't say that, but it just kind of accidentally happened to be the reading that makes better sense for what they personally believe. The other thing, the more problematic thing though, is how you actually translate the Greek, because there are ways to translate the Greek so that it doesn't look like there's a problem, but it's not a good translation of the Greek. And you get this even in the best translations. Just as one example, one of the striking things in the Gospel of John is that there are various places where, like, there's an inconsistency of some kind. And so, for example, it'll say that Jesus is doing something in Jerusalem, and then the next line will say, then he went into the land of Judea. Well, that doesn't make any sense because Jerusalem is in Judea. It's like that he was in Leeds and then he went into England. It's like, well, yeah, that doesn't make sense. And so what some translators, including the NRSV, do is they translate it to say, so he did this in Jerusalem, then he went into the countryside of Judea. Now it's not a problem, but it's not what the word means. It's kind of close to that. That is not what it means. And so translators can do that, and some translations are much worse at that than others. The New International Version is probably the best-selling translation, at least in America, probably in the world. The New International Version, and it's translated. My original Greek teacher was one of the original translators of it, so I appreciate it. I appreciate the committee. And a guy I co-wrote a book with is now like was the head of the revision committee. So I know these people, and so they're good people. They're good. These people are both excellent scholars, but they all have to be evangelicals who believe that the Bible is infallible. And there are places, especially in the Old Testament, where they just change things. I mean, it's like you shouldn't do that. Just let it say what it says.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you for that. I've always wondered that, and I've never known the answer. So that's really, really helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, really interesting. I'm kind of aware that I could ask you questions until the cows come home. But what I really wanted to touch on, kind of finally, Bart, really was talking about kind of your work and especially your blog, and how useful I found it. So I mean, I've been doing a few kind of audio recordings of your blog posts for your kind of gold subscribers to your podcast and to your blog, sorry. And I found it a really valuable resource for learning more about this stuff, because I mean I've got a degree in biblical studies and theology, but I'm learning so much every day from just kind of logging on and reading things myself. And I just wondered if you can kind of give us an insight into your blog, and also into kind of how you work and what your current projects are and what your kind of hopes are for the next year or so, if that's okay.
Yeah. So, you mean with respect to the blog or otherwise in terms of my prospects and hopes?
Yeah, yeah,
Just
whatever you
general.
want to talk about.
Well, let me talk about the blog for a few minutes. So, somebody a long time ago suggested I do a blog back in the early, like 2010 or something. I said, no, I don't want to do a blog. That's too much work. Why would I do that? The guy said, you can charge for it. I said, I got plenty of money. I'm fine. I don't want to charge for it. He said, you can give the money away. Oh, huh. Now that's an interesting idea. So I thought about it. God, it's so much work. I don't, no, I can't. I finally, 2 years later, I decided, okay, I'm going to do that. I'm going to start a blog and see if we can raise any money for charity. So in 2012, in April 2012, we started it. I got a guy who could do blog construction. Could do the technology, and he would do the technology, and I would write the posts. Um, so that was April. So yeah, so that's almost 9 years ago now. I have posted ever since then. I post 5 or 6 times a week, every week, and I don't believe I've ever missed a week since April 2012. I post about 1,200 words a day, five times, sometimes six a week, um, on everything having to do with the New Testament or early Christianity or cognate topics. I mean, I have, yeah, historical Jesus, the writings of Paul, how we got the Bible, the books that didn't make it in the Bible, the other Gospels, uh, persecution in the early church, women in the early church, Jews and Christians, the conversion of the Emperor Constantine, how Christianity took over the empire, just like, you name it, but also Greek and Roman religion, and from the time, what that was like, and Judaism, early Judaism, Hebrew Bible. So I'm not an expert on these other things as much as I am on the New Testament and early Christianity, but I have secondary expertise in all these areas. I've taught PhD level stuff in most of these areas, and so it's just stuff I know. People can make comments on any blog post, and they can ask questions, and I answer the questions. Every question. And so, yeah, so it takes a chunk of time, but we do it to raise, as you said, to raise money for charity. And we just started a new system where um, people can join at various tiers. If they just want to read what I've got to say, they join a kind of a lower tier, bronze. I mean, that's, it's the nuts and bolts. That's what they want. They want to hear what I have to say every day, so they do. Or if they want to make comments, it's a higher tier. If they want an audio version of it, then they join a higher tier, and that's where you've come in, Sam. So, Sam, we really appreciate you doing these readings because it's great, and we everybody in America loves the English accent. They've all added 40 points to your IQ, which is already very high. So you're doing great. So. Um, people won't know this, but my wife is a Brit, and so my family, so I spend a bit of time in England, and so yeah, so I'm joking on that. Although she too, they add points to her IQ too, and she does not need the help. So anyway, so that's it. And so right now I'm in the middle of this very long thread I've been doing for where did the Trinity come from, and like I could answer that in 1,000 words, but I decided to devote a very long thread on it. I've been spending about 3 weeks on it. So far, I've just gotten to how it is Jesus came to be thought of as God. I'm not even done with that one yet. And so it's, yeah. So, but then and I have some people do guest posts. So anyway, if people are interested, they should just check out the Bart Ehrman blog. Just look it up online, and they'll get it, and they can see what the options are. And every penny goes to charities. This last year, we raised $220,000 for charity. I don't know what the pound exchange rate is right now, but it's a lot of pounds too. This year, I'm thinking we're going to raise $250,000, $250,000, and so and it's just growing. It's growing. We're getting more members all the time. It's growing and growing. So yeah, what do I do? I mean, I teach. My day job is teaching. It's like this. So I just I taught a class today, and so I teach at UNC Chapel Hill. In addition to those two things, I do my research, and that takes a huge amount of my time. I've just published a book on heaven and hell a few months ago on where the ideas of heaven and hell came from, and the argument of that book. This would be the kind of book listeners would be interested in probably, is that I argue in the book that heaven and hell, the idea that you die and your soul goes to one place or the other to be rewarded or punished, is found nowhere in the Old Testament, and it's not what Jesus taught. So where'd it come from? That's the issue of that book. So I've just finished doing a scholarly book that is related in many ways. The scholarly book is about trips that they're journeys to the realms of the dead by living people. So this is a scholarly book, and so that phenomenon is called catabasis. Catabasis means going down, and so like you have a Greek person who goes down to Hades to see what it's like. And so I'm interested in the Christian materials from the second, third, and fifth up to the 5th or 6th centuries, where you have a guided tour of heaven and hell, one of which was influential on Dante later, the Apocalypse of Paul. So I deal with those Christian materials in relationship to Greek, Roman, and Jewish predecessors. So that's the kind of thing I'm doing. My next book, I'm just finishing that up now. My next book is going to be for a general audience. It's going to be about the Book of Revelation and how people misinterpret the Book of Revelation and have no clue what it's talking about, especially the people who write books about it. They generally have no clue. And so it's going to be contrasting what scholars know about the Book of Revelation with what you find in the popular press. It started out being a book about how people think that it's predicting what's going to happen in the near future. And I'm going to show that actually that's not what it's about at all, even though everybody reads it that way. And that actually historically, that's not how the book was read. People would be surprised. People think, well, it's always been read that way. No, it hasn't. So, yeah, so that's the next. So the thing is, I've always got books going, and I try to write books for a popular audience, and I try to write books for scholars. And so I kind of alternate. But the scholar ones take a lot more time.
Yeah, it's definitely a massive skill set to be able to do all that. That's for sure. I was going to kind of ask you. So obviously, someone kind of hears this podcast, hears about you, thinks I want to get involved. Obviously, there's the blog, which is a very accessible, good way to kind of engage with your work. But if you were to recommend a book for them to kind of start on their kind of Ehrman journey, what would be the book you'd want people to turn to first?
It really, my the books for popular audience have been geared toward they're all on different topics. And so my suggestion usually is to pick the topic you're most interested in. My best-selling book is the one you mentioned, Misquoting Jesus. For some reason, when they published it in England, they called it Whose Word Is It? I have no idea why they called it that, but so you can find it probably in England or that, or you can probably find it in Misquoting Jesus, because that's the one that sold. But it's the same book, just a different cover, different title on it. If people are interested in this question, like where heaven and hell came from, that's my most recent book. It's just called Heaven and Hell: A History of the Afterlife. If they're interested in what the Bible says about suffering and why suffering is a problem for Christian faith, it'd be the one we talked about, God's Problem. But I have books on my other most recent popular level book was on how Christianity took over the Roman world, which is a pretty big thing, because if it hadn't, we'd still be worshiping Zeus. And so the entire history of civilization would have been different. We wouldn't have had the kind of art and music and philosophy and literature that we've had. I mean, it would be huge. People don't realize how huge it was. And it wasn't a foregone conclusion. It was barely, may well not have happened. So that book is about that. That's called The Triumph of Christianity. And so people can just look me up and they'll see a list of my books and, pick one they think's interesting.
Absolutely. Bart, it's been so good chatting to you today. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. To leave any comments or thoughts, you can head over to YouTube. And to follow us on social media or to see where else we are online, hit the link in the description. Thank you to all our regular givers for making this dream a reality. I'll catch you here at the same time next week. Enjoy the journey.